The Platypus Affiliate Society, established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 30s, new 1960s to 70s, and post-political 1980s to 90s left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. So we have reading groups on Thursday from 6 to 9. We have coffee breaks from 5 to 7. On Tuesdays. Although the end of the school year is kind of winding down, so for you guys, it'll probably be different next quarter when we get back together in the fall. This teaching is called "What's Left After Trump." I'll start with a quote. This is a quote from LaSalle in a letter to Marx, dated December 12th, 1851. Hegel used to say in his old age that directly before the emergence of something qualitatively new, the old state of affairs gathers itself into its original purely general essence, into its simple totality, transcending it and absorbing back into itself all those marked differences and peculiarities which it evinced when it was still viable. And now I'll start my presentation proper. The left watches with horror as the Trump administration enacts sweeping orders, changing the political landscape around him. But Trump's barbarism isn't what horrifies the left, which we have seen from every capitalist politician. Rather, the real horror is that Trump acts vigorously while the left remains paralyzed and startled. The left constantly asks, is this really happening? Who will stand up for us? Clearly not the Democrats. Platypus says the left is dead, long live the left. This is a play on the old adage, the king is dead, long live the king. If we are currently amongst the dead left, who sits on the throne? Alas, the crown is heavy. Through the 20th century and up to the current day, the left's wishes have been perversely satisfied through the capitalist state, which reconfigures itself and capitalism to meet each crisis of society. When the left realizes that the reality they got was as dysfunctional as it always was, they complain. At the same time, the left chooses not to recognize their own complacency with this reality. This is the same under Trump. Thus, in 2025, it is the left that vehemently defends the waning neoliberalism against Trump, who wants to turn it belly up. The left, unable to grasp the total movement of history, still sings the same tune, even when the chords have changed. The crowd has left, favoring the right's once dissonant melody now playing in the right key, or just the simple pleasure of silence. Trump is the gravitational mass at the center of society, pulling all towards him as he commands the world's largest economic, political, and cultural force to break with neoliberalism's inertia. All particular sectarian differences in capitalism are merged into flat, homogeneous sides. It is the new regime versus the old. Revolution is upon us, but not from the left. It is capitalism itself which massively transforms objective conditions. The left, amidst its failure to do the same, assimilates into bourgeois social reality once more, as it falls below the consciousness required to transcend it. But this does not mean that we no longer need a left. Capitalism only changes itself out of a necessity to save itself from its most essential product, the proletariat. That bastard son who may have been the best claim to the throne than any existing royalty thus far. In other words, capitalism finds new ways to rearrange and redirect its fundamental crisis to avoid a total system collapse, or worse, socialist revolution. To make an omelet, one has to crack a few eggs. The old order of neoliberalism had to go, but who was going to pull the plug? In the absence of a socialist party, the Republicans who designed this system will be the same party who inaugurates its transformation. To be specific, neoliberalism is mainly attributed to the doings of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, the so-called Reagan Revolution. They intended to finally update the old modes of FDR's New Deal, the Ford Estate, and its policies. But we should remember that the impulse Reagan seized upon was first brought to the fore by 60s New Left's politics. who registered very similar discontents with Fordist life. The New Left opposed the inherently bureaucratic, hierarchical, alienating, consumerist, racist, sexist qualities of Fordism's interventions in society. Its radicals thought that state projects and electoral politics would never solve the underlying problems of capitalism. They weren't wrong, but as the New Left degraded into mere opposition to Fordism, capitalism proved capable of instituting the necessary changes to absorb their discontents. Capitalism didn't need to become something wholly reborn to resolve the New Left's demands. It already had the necessary dynamism to adjust, and so the left was, as we would say today, co-opted. In 1968, it was Nixon who ran as the anti-war candidate against the pro-war Humphrey. The Democrats tried to tout their own left candidate to capture the momentum behind Nixon's conservative realignment. I say left. But it was already too late. The unsuccessful 1972 McGovern campaign, which opposed the Vietnam War and advocated for social reforms, took many hints from the New Left and even adopted their personnel, primarily the feminist and queer rights people in the New Left. While McGovern was the farce of the New Left, perhaps Nixon was their triumph. We have him to thank for the EPA after all. Reagan's neoliberalism was the eventual answer for Fordist discontents, easing the state's role in economic life, cutting taxes and agency budgets, with the large exception of the Department of Defense. But his solutions came at a cost. This cost was reshuffled among capital's new configurations and capacities until its effects were too hard to ignore. Reagan inherited stagflation, but by the end of the 80s, the economy had hit its stride with his supply-side policies, stimulating capital circulation rather than economic demand like the Keynesian economists before him would have it. By the 90s, the U.S. economy entered a boom under Bill Clinton's third way policies, with NAFTA and welfare reform, in lockstep with Reagan's neoliberalism. But these golden years would not last forever. Neoliberalism's economic troubles reached a visible apex in the 2000s, culminating in the 2008 recession. Obama was meant to be the fix for neoliberalism, but only administered war and deportations. With Obama failing to be adequately anti-neoliberal, the American electorate defied all odds in 2016 by electing Donald Trump, a political outsider, against Hillary Clinton of Democratic nobility. Trump's 2016 campaign addressed what Americans hated about neoliberalism. Notably, where globalization was believed to undercut the quote-unquote forgotten men and women of the American working class, Trump promised to make America great again by closing the borders, opposing free trade agreements, and canceling unfair military agreements. But his first term was successfully thwarted by the political establishment through lawsuits, investigations, and impeachments. In his second term, Trump hopes to finally break the neoliberal will. In many ways, Trump resembles Reagan. Jump-started by a small loan of $1 million at the end of the 60s, Trump's business empire ascended under Reagan's rule. The 80s New Guard, spurred by Reaganomics, now makes an effective claim for the throne, hoping to restore their blighted nation. The left today can only express nostalgia for the 80s era of the old king, a positive vision for when the going was supposedly good. Believe it or not, the left did express a possibility of overcoming neoliberalism. We call this the millennial left. The anti-war protests of 2003 and 2008, Occupy Wall Street in 2011, all the way up to the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2015 to 2016, form the negative lessons which offer a key to the locked present, and Trump. The left opposed neoliberalism in its politics. This included Christian conservatism, austerity, identity as electoral constituencies, privatization, and deregulation. In the 2000s, there seemed to be a potential to overcome capitalism as people were talking about socialism. In this new moment, the left's history reared its head. When the new SDS was gaining traction, new leftists returned to tell these young radicals not to repeat their mistakes. Some listened, many didn't. Radical tendencies reemerged just to be rehashed. Millennial radicalism had to compete with the Democratic Party, who were looking for a leg up in elections and would absorb the millennials' discontents wherever their politics seemed assimilable. Where the millennial left could not offer a viable alternative to capitalist politics rendered their demands redundant. The millennial left was ultimately not up to the task, and in every defeat, their potential fell away as the moment for capitalism's transformation was seized by the capitalist parties themselves. In 2008, the anti-war protests and the subprime mortgage crisis raised Obama to the Oval Office, who the millennial left refused to protest as the first black president. In its final years, the millennial left's mere opposition to neoliberalism made it forever disoriented and reactionary. Where it understood neoliberalism to be divesting the state's purview over the economy, the left found itself advocating for the New Deal in neo-social democracy, peddling nostalgia for the 30s to 60s Fordist era. Bhaskar Sankara became the voice of millennial socialism after founding Jacobin in 2011. Answering his call, millennials flooded into the Democratic Socialists of America, a leftover from the 80s founded on the program to push the Democrats to the left, all in order to fuel Bernie Sanders' Pyrrhic 2016 presidential campaign. Sanders and the DSA, notably, were both artifacts of 80s anti-Reaganism. With neoliberalism, 80s anti-Reaganism. With neoliberalism codifying categories of oppression to ameliorate their inequalities, the left found itself jockeying for identitarian political rackets to preserve differences on their own terms. I think we know BLM, the Pussyhats, and Me Too a little too well. Preferring the solace of an eternal ontological struggle between oppressor and oppressed, the left relinquished their claim to history. Once the millennial left declared their own climax through the Democratic Party's nostalgic FDR rerun in Bernie, the door was shut on the millennials forever, although it had been in the process of closing for years, as its politics became palatable even for the Democrats. Trump emerged amidst this closure to clean house, successfully acting on what the millennials couldn't. We ought to remember Trump's 2000 presidential campaign, where he planned to run as a Democrat with Oprah Winfrey before switching to Ross Perot's Reform Party and finally dropping out of the race. His views then show a continuity through his present self. Trump, finally vindicated after his 2024 re-election, will now realize the vision of a frustrated Democrat from the turn of the century. Where millennial neo-social democracy advocated for statism contra the supposedly lax neoliberal state, Trump now uses the state to reassemble the world economic order to his liking. Where millennial identity politics wanted to ossify difference apart from politics, Trump now envisions a shared American identity. The left can only wish for a past moment to magically return. They wish for their own Communist Party, their own New Deal, their own Vietnam, their own early internet age. They wish they could protest like they used to return to a time in history when their demands were seen as radical, when they were not yet merely Democrats. That paradise didn't exist then, and it certainly doesn't exist now. Their demands, which they inherit from the past, were perhaps never radical to begin with. What is the left after Trump? Only a history of defeats revised into victories, images which today's left wish they could step into, just so they can relive the melancholy all over again. In last year's Palestine encampments and DNC protests, the students thought they could bring back 1968. Today's left is stuck in the past, only to repeat what had already gone awry. All the while, capitalism builds society anew on its own terms. The left will find this new reality unrecognizable when it wakes from its feverish slumber. It will complain again about the world it engendered through the failure to realize its own potential. The throne is empty, the left is dead. What's left after Trump? Only the opportunity to critically examine that history, where flashes of past possibility cast a long shadow of the accumulated failures to realize them. But this is only possible if the left is willing to put their dearest held beliefs on trial in the ruthless critique of everything. As the world order liquidates from Trump's thawing of neoliberalism, and even the 20th century more broadly, could the left possibly begin to make sense of this epochal change. We should not be scared of the new, even as they reconjure the horrible images of the old, the left's historical failures. We should instead aspire to be as fearless and radical as reality itself. The crown is heavy, long live the left. All right, so thank you. Now we can go into questions. I didn't want to make my remarks too long because I did want to invite questions. So if anybody has questions, raise your hand and we can go around. Yes, Ben.
A lot of this presentation seems to feel obligated to raise the conversation about Trump not as a matter of like what are his policies and what do they mean, but raise the history of the 20th century as maybe more important than anything specific to Trump. What do you make of that, and how is that more useful of a way to approach the problem?
I think the way that I'm trying to make sense of the Trump's policies in the present is that they seem to have like a sort of like historical analogy in the 20th century, especially through the New Left. And this seems to provide a sort of framework or a lineage about how like history and capitalism like sort of moves, like the movement of history through Trump. Because of course we shouldn't think about Trump merely as just like this kind of flash, like this sort of like just like moment which happens in a vacuum, and like, but that seems to be how it's taken up by the left, where it's just like, okay, Trump bad, you know, in the sort of like vacuum of like his like current policies, and it helps to remember that like the left, what Trump advocates for is sort of like a very like mangled version of like what the left, sort of the millennial left, wanted in order to resolve neoliberalism. And of course, that's kind of why I write in the beginning that the left's real fear is not that it's like Trump is doing all these like terrible things, because you could even make the point that like what Trump does, like in terms of like deportations or whatever have you, are not any worse than what Obama or Biden did. And so what they're really scared of is that Trump acts on neoliberalism's discontents, and the left doesn't do anything about it.
If I can ask a follow-up.
Yeah.
In New York, Platypus had a panel recently called Immigration and the Left, and I forget which speaker on it said this, but they said, so someone basically said, you know, you're calling Trump a fascist right now, but you called Reagan fascist in the 80s, so what are the stakes of that? And again, I don't remember who said it, but they basically responded, well, we called Reagan a fascist in the 80s, but we didn't mean it then. We mean it now. So what if Trump is actually like wholly different as far as like politics goes in capitalism? What if Trump is like the fascist bar none? Or why might that not be the case if that's not the case?
I suppose if we just like accept the conjecture that Trump is a fascist, then of course the question is like, how do we like, you know, what do we do about it, I suppose? Because like, just like, again, as you say, like the political stakes of the word fascist don't seem to really like mean anything insofar as like there's not like a specific like political like action, I guess, that immediately follows, although people are trying to make something of it. Because when I remember I talked to this professor on the Northwestern like Day of Action, and she was like, yeah, like Trump is a fascist, like look at like the definition of fascism I pulled from this one history text, and then like this is how we should, and then I asked her what should we do about it, like should we just like look back to like what they did against Hitler, and like do we need like a world war to like, you know, defeat Trump, right? And so it's like, actually if you evoke this kind of like this term, it actually doesn't immediately follow like what we should be doing about it, even if the conjecture was true. Of course, I would just put, if I were just like in the normal everyday conversation, I would just push back against the idea that Trump is a fascist, just on straightforward terms. But yeah.
Why so? Just because it seems as though that distinction didn't really bear out in the initial presentation as to why that's not the case.
As why Trump's not a fascist?
Yeah.
I suppose fascism, for me, I just take up the fascism, like, I think the way I learned fascism is, like, just, like, through the conversations we've had about the authoritarian personality. Like, that's how I kind of understand, like, authoritarianism. And perhaps, like, it is the case that, like, we're all just, like, you know, a little bit authoritarian to be, like, kind of coy about it. Like, there is, like, a crisis of, like, ego formation or whatever have you. But of course, I think my point about fascism is that perhaps also fascism is historically specific to like Fordism, and maybe it's just not useful anymore to think about it on those terms. Like when they would call like Hitler and Stalin fascists. It seemed to be like the material and political conditions then were different than they are now.
Thanks.
Okay. Someone who's not Ben. Does anybody have a question?
Can we make the point that the very question about this fascism thing,
Mhm.
like, okay, your point is I take your stance that it's not very important or not that pertinent to categorize with reference to the fascist term, but my concern is, but why people are like inclined to sort of categorize Trump as fascist in the first place? What kind of like sentiment does this reflect?
Yeah. I mean, they called FDR a fascist, the Communist Party, when FDR tried to institute the New Deal. I feel like my answer is not very good, but I think why are people calling Trump a fascist? I think if I'm trying to give like a kind of off the cuff answer because I haven't really thought about this that hard, but like people think Trump is a fascist on the terms that like it's like my guess is that he's sort of like overturning like the sort of established political order. He kind of
Can I interject here?
Sure.
Maybe just as material for consideration, right? On the left, I feel like the group that has hegemony over like Trump as fascist par excellence is like the REVCOM, the Revolutionary Communist Party. I follow their account on Instagram, and I'm just like constantly seeing posts about Trump as white supremacist, male supremacist, like xenophobe.
yeah.
Like those are I think the categories that people take as indicative of Trump's fascism. And so my question is, I think the question you're also asking is like what allows people to read it on those terms? What's the use of reading it on those terms or not?
Yeah, maybe I just don't engage with the left like around me enough because yeah, I don't hear people calling Trump a fascist as much as maybe I just don't keep up with the news, but I think from what I've seen it's like the real like fascism of Trump. I think the main way I've heard it is like through immigration, his immigration policies, as in like he's sending people to concentration camps. He's like, like a xenophobe. And I think what that is getting at is like, yes, there's like this sort of like loose sort of historical tie, which is like, okay, like Hitler put people in concentration camps, and he was like, he hated, like, he was super anti-Semitic and like stuff like that. And these like categories have sort of like just like mapped one to one with each other without understanding like their historical referent. Um, like maybe like one way to I think about it is like it was like Adorno who said uh, like the biggest losers of like the Holocaust were like was like the working class. But it seems like today that, and this is really like kind of like a kind of snide way of putting it, but like the biggest winners of Trump's immigration policies are the American working class.
Is that
Um,
true? Do you really believe that?
I mean, insofar as that Trump's, whether or not his economic policies like play out exactly how he wants it to, like that's not up to me, of course. But it seems like what Trump's trying to do is like, you know, kind of insulate the American like industrial workers from like these sort of immigrants who are like, you know, taking the jobs or whatever have you. And that seems to be like the aim of the political intention of his economic policy. Whether or not it plays out that way, again, not up to me. And also at the same time, like when we think about like Trump and his tariffs, for example, like Trump sets these tariffs at like a extremely high rate, but then of course like the economy and like the sort of like current like owners of wealth in the country are like freaking out, right? And so then he has to like kind of like bounce back his tariffs and so on and so forth. So like neoliberalism and its sort of structuring will kind of, it will pose a resistance against Trump, which will not make his policies as straightforward as like he would want it to be. But for Trump, it's a long political game that he's been playing since 2016. And so, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if in 10 years we're experiencing some kind of economic revival.
I think it's like bold to suggest that perhaps working class people aren't going to emerge as a winner, as you say.
And of course,
Excluding your portion on immigration, I think everything else kind of suggests otherwise for now. I'm thinking about cuts. First of all, like the different tax policies, like the working class people get the worst in sort of the tax cuts that he's making, or like businesses and tariffs. It's the small businesses that can't get the exemptions on tariffs right now. And I'm also thinking about how I'm mostly sympathetic to what you're saying, at the same time contextualizing immigration and deportation as saving American jobs, that in itself, I don't think I can follow.
here's maybe a different, I mean, you mentioned small businesses, right? And I think like the small business, like NGO sort of structure. Well, first I'll just preface by saying like I don't defend Trump, of course. Like it's not like we're here to like, you know, be like Trumpists. But we have to understand what Trump's political, make sense of Trump's political game in order to formulate a politics against it. And then to your point, it's like, yes, like these structures, like small businesses, NGOs, like the academy, Trump is obviously like trying to definance like all of that through the state. And the real question is, if the working class isn't going to win from Trump, why did they vote for him? You know.
I guess what you're getting at is kind of like the conditional possibility of Trump's winning in the first place. Like how does his political agenda becomes appealing to the working class in the first place?
I mean,
regardless of its whether it will actually benefit them.
I mean, again, like when Trump is like liquidating like all these different structures of neoliberalism, like I mean, I think like the fiercest example is like the academy with like anti-DEI, like shutting down of grant programs and stuff like that. And what this is a response to, at least how I understand it, is like Trump is like, yes, like the left is like in the academy, like we remember like the new left long march to the academy, and it seems like the academy, the universities are just like this like democratic bastion of like basically just like propaganda. And I suppose the question for us is like, on the one hand, like, how can you say that like the academies aren't like these like kind of like democratic propaganda machines? But on the other, it's like, again, when we come back to the idea of like who wins and who loses, like these structures which like formerly may have like supported or like employed working class people, of course like those people are going to like quote unquote like lose, I guess. But the point is like not that like Trump, it just like destroys everything and like he just like leaves it in that way, but like new forms of capital and its movement and like the economic structure will rise in their place, and so that provides new economic opportunities for working people, I suppose. What it really is that like yes, like these immediate policies, whether they play out, it might even be just like a non-issue, whether like they perfectly play out, because again, it's like, to kind of be a little bit snide about it, again, it's Trump's utopianism. Like he has a vision for what post-neoliberalism will look like, and just because it's not already here doesn't mean that everything Trump does in a sort of like this sort of like shake up, this sort of like resisted like push, doesn't mean that like all of that chaos is like it's just like automatically just like this like ultra destructive force that we should just like immediately oppose.
In the vein of that question, I wonder, what does it mean to say that a particular development within capitalism is a win for the working class or any other group, if that like matters? Because maybe this is my ultra leftism, but I feel like barring the revolution, nothing is a win for the working class.
Yeah, I think what I mean by win is just like employment, just like people getting employed. Yeah, like maybe the sort of like very semantic distinction here is like working class and like proletariat. Like of course, like the working, like what Trump wants, I feel like in the end is just like employment. That's like the ultimate like bread and butter question of capitalism per se. Like if more people can be employed, then that's like I guess like in the very like bourgeois way, that's a win. But of course for us, like no capitalist politician is like a win or a lose really. It's all part and parcel of the historical movement of bourgeois society at large. And of course, yeah, as you say, nothing is a win, I guess, besides just like the dictatorship of the proletariat. Yeah. Okay. We can move on to the next question if anybody else has any questions. Yeah, you can keep going.
I'm also wondering this. I feel like the presentation by and large has a focus on Trump as like domestic figure.
Yeah.
You're talking about ways in which these shifts in the composition of capitalism are like domestic in nature, domestic policy. It's like what does the economy look like? I wonder what it means to situate Trump as an international phenomenon. What is the world looking like with respect to Trump? What is the left's relationship to it? The two obvious examples that come to mind are the fact that, I can't say with, causal confidence, but it seems as though a large element of Trump's successful election to his second term was discontent with the Biden presidency's handling of the conflict in Israel-Palestine. So, in what way does Trump relate to a phenomenon like that? And then on the other hand, it seems as though what one could consider the rival superpower, China, and its role in the global economy, if we're thinking about Trump, like a Trumpian realignment as some sort of contestation of what's necessary to save the world economy or save the American economy. Like, China seems to be a contending power, and I know, of course, there are many people on the left who are saying that one ought to be like supportive of China contra Trump. I don't know if I can really synthesize this into like a specific question, but I guess the easiest way to pose it is just like, what does it mean to think about Trump, about these things in addition? Does it provide any kind of insight, or do we need to think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I just follow Chris on this idea, which is like, especially with regard to Trump's tariffs, it's like what Trump is like addressing is like the sort of like unfair like trade, like sort of relations with other countries, like that, like, the relationship between China and the U.S. like trade wise is like detrimental to the U.S. And so it's like he, with like his economic policies, it's like he's like finally putting the cards on the table, and especially with regards internationally, with the economy, every country has to contend with the U.S. in terms of trade. And so, Trump is kind of like almost putting up like a bluff. Like, he's putting all his cards on the table and he's saying, okay, like XYZ country, like if you don't want to do this, like you're going to suffer, basically, in order to like kind of, he's trying to strong arm these other countries into kind of into a different system of trade agreements. I'm not a very strong like economist, but that's kind of how I understand it. And so this is kind of China as like the sort of like emerging world economic superpower is of course the main contender with this, but and the main focus of this. Especially as China's like exports and imports with regards to the U.S. is mainly export favored, as far as I'm aware. But this happens with every other country, like Canada, the EU, especially, Mexico, like the Middle East. So it's happening on all levels for Trump. And with regards to Israel-Palestine, I mean, I haven't had really much time to make sense of it because Trump has been like kind of surprisingly the one who's been like, yes, like Israel is committing a genocide, like kind of. I'm reminded of like Haaretz being like, oh, is Trump like pro-Palestine now? Like what? And so it does seem like Trump is the being anti-war, which is like somewhat interesting to me. Although I'm not exactly sure how to make sense of it. My guess is that he's sort of absorbing discontents with the Israel-Palestine war more largely, as in like the American government is like funneling money to Israel, and maybe he sees that as just like unfair for America. Like, why are we like in this agreement in the first place. Although, yeah, I haven't had much time to make sense of that.
Alan, do you have any questions?
Yeah, maybe we just like turn into like a roundtable discussion at this point.
Well, after doing this, we were talking about this yesterday.
Yeah.
After you've writing and teaching is like a pretty hard thing to do because you're forced to kind of like make. Well, you don't actually have to make an argument for teaching. That's maybe people think that, but you do actually have to like think about the subject matter that you're writing about. And after you've written this, how do you feel about the millennial left, like as something? Because that felt like a big threat that we were talking yesterday. And
Yeah.
also, how do you feel about Trump? Because I feel like actually the Zoomers don't really think about Trump as much.
Yeah. When I was writing this a lot, I was thinking about how I could possibly respond to someone who is just like a kind of like average Northwestern leftist.
Who's that to you?
SJP, I suppose. I don't. Again, like, maybe this doesn't have to like make it into the video, but it's like, I'm not. Wherever the Northwestern leftists are, they're difficult to find, and then they're also difficult to talk to sometimes.
Well, maybe just to use Occam's razor here, what that seems to imply is just that, like, whoever sociologically might have been a leftist 10 years ago is not political today.
Yeah, that's true.
And so are you speaking to them, like the person who just, like, seems just totally detached for politics, or is it someone else?
Probably like the anti-Trumpists. Although, yeah, again, like it's hard.
Is that
I-
Democrats or is
I-
that leftists?
It's hard to say. I mean, it's kind of when you say like leftists and Democrats, I'm like,
Well, there's someone who called themselves a Democrat, and there's leftists who are basically Democrats.
yeah. I think it's hard to like put a demographic on it. I don't think I can like speak to that because I don't speak to them. Yeah, period, pretty much. But I think when I was writing this teaching, I'll just go back to Clay's original question. I think when we were talking about one thing that was really difficult for me was just to like make a judgment call on when the millennial left had an opportunity. Because every time that you want to put a date on it, it seems like that date, it seems like that moment like flitters away somehow. Like there, you could find like just like the moment of like, you could find the moment of like failure, which just like kind of ruptures the whole thing, I suppose. Like, who was really radical or like a Marxist back in like 2008, 2011? Perhaps besides Platypus.
Well, what that even mean to try to be a Marxist?
Right.
That's the other thing too, because it's Platypus Marxist, and it's like that. I mean, the people in Platypus, I'm sure, would like to be Marxist, but
Yes.
it's like it also presents this whole political project.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like a big question mark of what that would even mean.
Exactly. I think like every time you try to like grasp the moment, it sort of runs away. Like for me at least.
But is there really a grasping of moments? Because speaking this from a very good old Leninist point of view, for you to grasp a moment, you have to have like organization, or in other words, you have to be in some sort of power, like you have.
Or in the struggle.
Yeah.
Yeah, and was there like any moments like that?
I suppose the way I try to work through it is through Platypus, like to try to grasp what the millennial left was, because I think there is that kind of ambivalence that I have. It's just like, if I try to call like the moment, like it seems to be like just inadequate any which way you put it. But at the same time, if I call no moment, as in the millennial left has no potential, then it seems like there's nothing to be learned from the past 20 years. That's the difficulty I think I'm having with digesting the millennial left and neoliberalism.
It seems like what matters more right now is not necessarily saying what the moment is, because it's an open question of whether that's possible in the same way as what Oliver just said, but that it might actually be useful to identify what the moment is not.
Yeah.
Because it seems as though what might matter, if one is still committed to the idea that there's a place for the left in history, is being able to make sense of the present. But we can't make sense of the present because of what we just talked about. But what might be possible is clarifying or making clear misapprehensions that are taking place. And that seems to be more the substance of a teach-in like this. I asked toward the beginning of the Q&A about why you seem motivated to raise Trump as like a phenomenon paralleling the 20th century. That seems to be what it's about, which is like the negative lesson of Trump being similar to a lot of these other phenomena. And so, insofar as the opposition to Trump seems to reflect the opposition to those things, and those themselves fail to amount to a left, it may imply that we ought to take heed of those failures in order to take our own moment seriously.
Yeah, I mean, Trump as like the sort of as a moment in the movement of history, I suppose. And this goes back to Clay's question about Trump as well. Trump, I think, when I see like anti-Trumpism, when I like kind of bear witness to like these responses to Trump, like it really does feel like it's like, I don't know, like I'm kind of being mean about it, but it's like kind of pitiful, you know, like it's like I wish the best for these people, you know. They're nice people, I'm sure, but it's just like, what are you getting out of it? And I think what really happens at a top level is that like the neoliberals, like the neoliberal elites, are the ones who make the most like vehement defense against Trump through capital, as in they raise their own like capital in order to oppose Trump's economic policies. And so this is like the real like anti-Trumpism. But the left, I mean, they don't command anything really. And so it seems just like just like bashing their head against a wall. But of course there are kind of like new tendencies under Trump, like we can talk about like neo-Stalinism, and like, but even these people, these leftists, don't recognize themselves with regards to like post-neoliberalism, I suppose.
I can't help but think about Moishe Postow's History and Helplessness. And
Yeah.
talking about like the real anti-Trumpism is like the neoliberal old guard.
Yeah.
Which of course Trump might be the Judas of, right?
Right.
But implications of that metaphor notwithstanding. Postone in the early 2000s is writing this article basically giving a warning to the nascent anti-war movement, saying that if the material of your politics amounts to an anti-Americanism rather than sort of like a positive Marxism or whatever it is, what you end up materially operating as is a appendage of like the real political forces, namely the like reactionary Islamism of the predominant political forces in Iraq or Pakistan or wherever else. I'm not sure what like nuance that adds to the conversation, but it's interesting that that seems to be the parallel. I mean, you use the phrase mere opposition a few times. I think that's really what like
Yeah.
for me, but I guess a good way to turn this into a question is like in 2003, it seems as though, you know, Platypus in a lot of ways was founded as a consequence of that post-Stone essay. Like not singularly and not maybe most importantly, but of course it seems as though Platypus existed in order to take stock of that warning.
Mm-hmm.
If a teaching like this seems to be applying a similar logic to the present moment, then mere anti-Trumpism is not politics. Who can receive that?
What do you mean by who can receive that?
Who can receive it? Like, if you're telling this, who are you telling it to? Can the people around us make use of it in any way?
I mean, the other thing is that Northwestern studies, like, is anti-Trumpism. I mean, I don't even know if the students are really anti-Trumpist
Yeah.
in the way they were when I was here, when it was Trump's first term in office, because actually people seem like actually be politicized now.
Yeah, there's just like I mean, when I say like Northwestern leftists, it's like 30 people, you know, in one group chat, I suppose. Like, sorry to make it like kind of, yeah, I'm being mean, but it's like, like, it is really just like extremely politically apathetic these days, I suppose. I mean, like I write in like the daily with like pretty much no fear, like even if it's like somewhat like kind of political, because I just know people like just don't care. Like it's kind of like in like an opportunist way. It's just like I can kind of, I think the reason why like Platypus is able to kind of function on campus without much resistance is just like, yeah, people just don't like even need a sense of us in order to like function in their daily lives, because
there's things that like scratch people. If students are very like worked up over the Israel-Palestine thing, maybe there's like an intervention to be made in people's thinking there. Maybe it's sort of like a matter of like where can you actually kind of like pull a scab off on like people, because I mean people are not like, you can say it's like, oh, there's only 30 leftists on campus in Northwestern. The other end of it is that everyone on campus at Northwestern is like a leftist, but they're just like, it's like their default mode of thinking.
yeah.
Well, there's also the parallel problem, which is that relative to the student population, odds are much stronger that those 30 leftists are going to become PhDs publishing, you know, articles
yes.
and doing lectures
Yes.
on
They might have like an outsized influence.
how to make sense of politics.
Yeah, if these people become intellectuals, then we have to deal with them.
Well, they can flip it and just say they will become intellectuals.
That's true.
It's not just if they become intellectuals. They're going to like a major university and they're like talking about leftism and they're writing like their undergraduate theses about such and such and how Hamas is like actually Leninist or something like that. And these are going to be the people who are going to be educating students in 20 years.
But just to make the point especially clear, right, drawing it back to my initial question, where it seems as though the same sort of credo of post-Stone was in conversation with a left which was seriously, with a left that had a real possibility of developing into a serious social force. Today, it seems as though like the only function of this conversation is just to like
Put it out there.
just to like stop the like flame of the
Yeah.
people who might be making that mistake, even though
It's-
that mistake the stakes of that mistake right now don't seem to be the same thing.
It's like the SpongeBob roller coaster, like just going over the little hump and being like, you know, like I mean, and then I'm here like, stop having fun, maybe, like, you know, that's that maybe I'm just yucking their yum, but I think if I'm trying to like make something clear, I mean, maybe perhaps this conversation is meant for like those who are depoliticized, as in it's like, don't come back into politics, like if this is all it is, then you're not missing out on anything, you know, which could be that could be just like actually extremely just like that could be just like an extremely depressing message, but it's like, yeah, like, you know, the stakes for the left are just like incredibly like pitiful, you know, and like, you know, capitalism just like totally operates like over and above them in every sense. But I suppose there is this kind of like fog in this sort of fog of like, you know, discontent with Trump. Like I think probably actually not amongst the students, but amongst the faculty, it's extremely like polarizing for them. Like I remember the Northwestern Day of Action, that was pretty much entirely put on by professors, and
Who attended it?
like almost like 100 like university professors in like the AAUP here,
What's the
American Association for University Professors, I think.
Did students attend?
Yes, and I remember I wrote this to the list. The students were just there actually to just go up and like they asked them to like recite their fears, basically, and they're all like, you know, they all just went up one by one. They're like, I'm afraid of climate change. I'm afraid of, you know, our rights being taken away and such. And I was there pretty much as like one of like 5 other students who weren't speaking. And it was really imagistic. It was just like all these old professors like cheering and clapping every time they'd say something like very simple, like, you know, I want to fight for my future. I want to fight for climate change. Like I'm afraid of this and that, and it's like I'm like, what's happening here? And also, of course, the professors seem to be the most vocal in like the newspaper about, you know, signing letters or whatever. And yeah, it seems like the people who are most activated are just like the older folks out there who are just like probably most likely because it's just like like maybe if I'm to be really cynical about it, like their jobs are threatened.
What are the students getting from these people? Because they are the people that are educating them.
Well, actually, I talked to one professor about education, and actually what it seems like is they don't want to educate the students because the students are supposedly already radical. That the professors had nothing to teach them because, you know, let the students be. Like the students are already radical, they know what they're doing, let them be. That's in the interview I had with Leslie Harris at the Day of Action. It's like these professors, I asked them like, what is
radical mean?
You know, I mean protests, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
Like literally, you know, I mean they're like, you know, like, oh, we're for teach-ins and whatever, you know, when the protests happen, or like but yeah, like a political education that seems to be a given for like the university, for the professors. But I mean, perhaps it's not the shared sentiment of all the professors, but I think that's kind of a common sentiment, which is like the students, they're already so radical, like, you know, they're so anti-racist, they're so protesty, they're so, you know, they're so pro-Palestine or whatever have you.
Maybe to resituate this thread in Trump too.
Yeah.
Right. Do you think that this disposition is a phenomenon actually of like changed conditions for doing these sorts of things? Like, is it actually the fact that Trump is president rather than Biden that it seems as though like it's I don't know, psychologically or politically satisfactory just to say like my opposition is sufficient insofar as I like know that what's happening is wrong? Is it like a felt helplessness contrary to the Democrats, or why are people like this?
Yeah, I think it's like I think more people are ambivalent about being anti-Biden than anti-Trump.
More people are ambivalent about being anti-Biden
than anti-Trump. As in, like, it seems just like obvious for them just to like, that their anti-Trumpism is just the entirety of their leftism. Whereas under Biden, it's like, oh, these are the Democrats. Like, this is my team, I guess. Like, what's up with that?
the encampments are like a halftime.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Like the encampments were like, guys, like, wait, like, like.
You should be anti-Israel.
Yeah, like what are you guys doing? Like, what are the Dems doing? I was surprised that actually, I mean, I think like the alternate history where Kamala is president would have been like really interesting. Because I mean, I just like what does the left even do with that really? Perhaps it's just like another 4 years of Bidenism, but again, I think that's besides the point. Like, yeah, like I forgot your question, but like it really does seem like Trump is like I think one person put it well in the list. It was like Trump is like, or like protesting Trump XYZ. It's like sort of just like it's like satiating, I guess.
Stating what?
A desire to be political in the first place, I think, which without socialism, it seems like totally like apolitical. Like the world seems apolitical. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to go into like psychology of it too much, but
No, but you can take that, I guess, as an ideological critique point, where this whole where protesting Trump is becoming such a safe choice psychologically that it almost become apolitical. My point is like it looks political, but it's in fact apolitical precisely because it's psychologically safe.
I think it's like, sorry, like, honestly, like, this is kind of like really depressing, but like the main way like I see like the left outside of like, like just like going to their meetings like every month or so, like it's through just like Instagram posts. Like I see, like I go through the Instagram stories and it's like, like the impact post of like Trump is doing this, and it's like the little comment where it's like this is terrible or something like that, and it's like it's like screaming into the ether, although I guess I'm like also screaming into the ether a little bit, but it's like I don't know, like it is kind of like psychological, where it's like expressing your discontents through like the internet, or just like through like kind of like these like semi-public means is like it's like, either it's like you've done your part. That's kind of like the psychological aspect of it. It's like I'm sufficiently like anti-Trump, like even though like there's a total inability to like affect whatever Trump does.
It's like it's not just like one's choice to be depoliticized, but actually that in many ways there doesn't seem to be like politics to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That like, I mean, I guess your two choices are just to like go post on your Instagram or don't post on your Instagram. I mean, that's like
You
really.
could canvass for the midterms. You could if you're if
That's
states,
true.
I suppose you could support a non-Republican House candidate for office.
That's true. But I guess I guess the question is if you're like a leftist, like if you're like not like.
DSA does that. I mean, at its worst, it does that, but they do it. No.
Right, and I think there is like a sort of dissatisfaction. Like when I talk to people, like just like my friends, like there is this dissatisfaction with like the two parties, and so that seems to be like kind of like when you just talk to like the normal average student, it's like that's kind of like like I don't really support either party, like I don't involve myself with that at all, and it's like okay, then and then I suppose it's just like. It depends on the person. Like either they could just be like affirmative of the status quo, I suppose, like just like apolitical or just uncaring. But sometimes it's like they wish there was like a third party politics or something. But I mean, there just seems to be like zero opportunity for that at the moment.
Just a technical question. What do you mean by Fordism in your presentation?
Fordism, as in, like I mentioned Fordism alongside FDR's New Deal. And it's like pretty much just like the state, like how I understand it is like the state like basically generates like demand through the economy by just like either like hiring the surplus workers, although I suppose Reaganism also does that, and then also like the main component for me is like the state bureaucracy, which seems to like oversee like economic activity or economic life in their specific country. Yeah, that's what I mean by Fordism.
And also manufacturing, right?
Yeah.
Because you're talking about Ford, like your car.
Yeah, like the factory job, I suppose.
That's where you compare that with Stalinism.
Stalinism, I suppose, I put the emphasis on the state bureaucracy. I guess like the period of Stalin, because I think Platypus would take up a different definition of Stalinism, just other than just like the bureaucracy.
Well, in its own moment, of course, you do have someone like Burnham, James Burnham, I think that's his first name, who suggests that the communist bloc, Nazi Germany, and FDR's New Deal all represent different flavors of the same converging tendency towards managerialism.
Yeah, the managerial. Yeah.
Wait, sorry, what?
The managerial class.
Managerialism. That all of them seem to represent like some sort of transformation from capitalism as being about capitalists to managers. That seems to me related to Fordism, which is that it insofar as one contests that it is still capitalism, what seems to change about capitalism is that it becomes, it demands a far more intense intervention in order to sustain its underlying systems. It needs planning, it needs management, which of course Ford introduces on the factory, and that's his sort of extraordinary innovation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I was just wondering if that could be clarified, if that was helpful.
Yeah. I think when I think about Fordism, just to like follow it a little bit, it's like this sort of like Kafka-esque like image, I guess. That's kind of how I like almost like imagine it. Like what people's discontents with Fordism would be.
That it's just like labyrinthine.
Yeah.
Authority.
A labyrinthine bureaucracy, I guess. Or like like this like state apparatus, like deep state apparatus, that like.
Deep, right? It shouldn't be deep.
Yeah, but like deep. I mean just like deep state in the way it's like you're not elected into those positions.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's not seen like it's not oversighted by like electoral politics. But yeah, I mean that's like kind of how I imagine like Fordism. It's like that.
previous discussion. But what is the big topic? What is left? What is left after Trump? I mean, this topic begs the question of like the left's relation with Trump, begs the question of left's relation with the liberals, which I think might be more important to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
In a sense, where okay, if you're anti-Trump as a left, are you okay? It's kind of like political judgment. Are we gonna join liberals in the anti-Trump movement, or are we staying by? Like, how do we approach this with regards to liberals?
Like who is we? Like the left?
The left, okay, the left.
How should the left approach the liberals? I mean,
With in the face of Trump.
in the face of Trump.
Yeah. So it's like trilateral relation.
I mean, should the left engage with should the left have a straightforward relation with the liberals
Or
in order to I mean, that seems to be kind of what's happening right now. It's like the left is coalescing with the Democrats in order to have an opposition against Trump. It's like coalition.
yeah, and also I mean in the sense that I was in this webinar and the topic was about okay, it's something like the left is now finding themselves defending the same liberal principles that they were against.
Neoliberal principles, perhaps.
I mean,
Could you specify maybe, just give a little more detail about what you mean?
as in it's like the freedom and rights, that sort of thing, which is okay. It's like what the professors are asking the student to do on I don't know what that is, but on that thing.
I know what you're saying.
And yeah.
I mean, can I give a concrete example maybe?
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
don't know if this is what you mean, but I feel like something I found really funny is that an extraordinarily important element of anti-neoliberalism through the 80s into at least the 2000s, probably the 2010s, was discontent with the free trade regime that Reagan brought about, right?
Mm-hmm.
Free trade, of course, being the lowering of tariffs. And something that is funny, I guess, without passing any particular judgment on it, is that it seems as though Trump says, this isn't working anymore. Something's got to give, regardless of whether the strategy which follows is going to work. And the left's response becomes tariffs are bad economics, which of course was the neoliberal critique of
the Fordist.
One neoliberal critique of the Fordist state. And so there's this peculiar inversion where the left's opposition to Trump becomes the neoliberal criticism of the New Deal, but Trump isn't the New Deal.
Yeah, Trump
It's
isn't.
something else. So it just seems as though the more you think about it, it just becomes this horrifying mutated chimera.
Yes.
Where it doesn't make any sense in history, but also it seems to bag it.
Yeah, maybe they call Trump a fascist in the same way they call FDR a fascist,
Which is just horror at the ability of capitalism to co-opt your demands.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, I think the really, truly incredible thing about this sort of inversion is that it's you kind of want to shake them and be like, do you know what you're saying? Do you know who you're defending? Because if they did, it would just express a ginormous dissonance for them for the left, that the left is the left are the most ardent defenders of neoliberalism today. Like they're the ones who are like, you know, like keep down tariffs, like open the borders, keep like our military installments. Maybe not that far, but like, you know, preserve identity constituencies in politics. I think something I wanted to raise, because we talked about this earlier, like a couple days ago, was again this the identity politics thread, which is particularly kind of like an American phenomenon a lot. But it's like the new left is like, okay, like identity, like we have to like ameliorate difference, or we should like preserve difference, but like, you know, make like this like kind of like equal claim for our identities. Maybe I'm vulgarizing it there. And then it's like neoliberalism takes up this kind of like, they kind of neoliberalism like preserves this like idea of like political constituencies in politics. Or that seems like that's like tautological. Like identity constituencies in politics. Like the Democrats are like specifically like especially under Obama and Biden and such. Like they're like, we advocate for like black people, we advocate for like women and queer rights and stuff like that. And then the left actually, I think when I think about it more, like it actually, the left has like an opposition to that, because it seems like the left, through their ideas, like wants to like constitute identity outside of the state. Like I think about like BLM in particular.
Well, that is a demand on the state, you know?
I was
like, it's,
like defund the police, yes.
I mean, this thought occurred to me a couple times recently, which is like when one says Black Lives Matter, like who are they telling it to? And it seems as though it's about like the state should recognize that Black Lives Matter, that they should like tell their police to stop killing black people. Like that's where the like pivot point of the policy is.
I think like the most radical elements of like BLM are like blackness is like an ontological category, which is like in which the violence of which is like preserved in the state, like through like the carceral system or like police. But it like this like there's really this kind of push for like blackness as like this like eternal ontological category of like American life or like international life, in which like they're like permanent slaves, etc. Right? Although, I mean, I could getting my history wrong, but like that seems to be like the most radical element of like, and BLM seems to be the kind of like the conservative turn of that. And so there really, I think, when I'm trying to reflect on it, and like again, I could be getting this wrong. It's like contra neoliberalism, like these like these postmodern like identity movements are trying to remove these categories as political and make them just like eternal social categories, basically. And now that we've entered Trump, who is advocating for, I mean, even Trump 2016, like when Trump entered office in 2016, he was like kind of like being like, oh, we're the Americans, make America great again. And then BLM in 2020 was like, actually, no, race is political again. Like these like constituencies are political again.
America was never great. I mean, wasn't that the like the byline of the 1619 project?
I suppose, yeah. I don't remember much about that, but yeah. And so, now it seems like identity politics really is like defending neoliberalism's identity politics. If I'm trying to make like a decent example of that. And this appears, of course, in like the whole trans rights debate, which is like suddenly flaring up again. I'm not exactly sure where and why, or who is doing it exactly, but or like even if Trump is like doing anything about trans rights, maybe there's like a fear about it, or like there's like a bill on the House floor or something. But it's like, yeah, now we're back to that moment where the left defends neoliberalism's identity politics.
Maybe to raise an historical analogy, I'm not sure how like causal it actually is, but it does seem like an interesting parallel, which is that Eugene Debs in the early 1900s is talking about what is the Socialist Party, and he says that the Democrats are the part. He says the Republicans are the party of big capital, the Democrats are the party of the middle class, and only the Socialist Party represents the working class. And sorry.
Yeah, music.
And following the New Deal, there seems to be this realignment, not in terms of like the categories, but the distribution of them. So now it's like the Socialist Party seems just like to have totally waned. By the time of World War II, the communists like are explicitly mandated by the Comintern to support FDR, and so it seems as though the Democrats become the party of the working class, the Republicans become the party of big capital, and it's really just like where the middle class falls. That seems to be reconfigured, especially after the civil rights movement, where
The Republicans are the
but in part because they're able to vote now, like you have a black constituency.
yes.
Yes. I think it's a phenomenon of the phenomenon of second wave feminism, as well as a variety of other kind of like identity oriented movements. Politics starts being litigated in terms of like who gets what group. In a way in which people talk about like the black vote or the women vote.
Yeah.
Which I can't say with confidence was not the case earlier, but it seems as though that's like the frame that it gets talked about. What seems striking to me about Trump is that actually in a lot of ways that kind of dynamic seems to be dissolving. Not just because where those groups are like falling at the end of the day is changing, that you seem to have like more black people voting for Trump, more Hispanic people voting for Trump, fewer women voting for Trump, which is it seems to be a contrary dynamic. But like, it's not just about like what are the trends in those groups, but that it seems as if the politics isn't about those groups per se. I mean, I'm thinking about your question earlier about like what does it mean to say the working class is like benefiting from Trump's immigration policy, and maybe it's not about that at all, but it's that it doesn't seem to be that Trump is framing his politics as a matter of like I'm anti-Hispanic or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to be that black people are voting for Trump as Americans. I think this goes back to the question we've been like having a conversation about is like, do people who are like of marginalized identities, quote unquote, do like black people want to be black? Or like do like
What does that mean? What do you mean by that?
as in like do
You
they
mean, like insofar as the state treats them?
No, it's just like so like categorically, like do they want to like
Do
identify
they
as black?
associated with black politics?
No, it's just like the ontological category of just like, do I want to call myself black? I think that's been bubbling for quite a while. Like I always bring up the Andrea Longchu article, which is always asking like, do Asians want to be Asians? Like,
Yeah, I mean that's the problem of identity politics, because there isn't a perfect identity in the first place. Identity as in A equal to A.
Yeah,
Like
self-sameness.
Yeah. Yes.
But it's never the case, right?
But also just like identity is like a historical product rather than an ontological a category. And this seems to just like provide like a huge disorientation for identity politics. But I mean, it's still, of course, like the identity politics stuff is still strong amongst people. And like, if anything is like, if apolitical people are political about anything, it's like this like default thinking about identity politics. about how we ought to treat like X, Y, and Z marginalized identity.
I mean, I'm thinking about your initial presentation, which is that. I'm thinking about your initial presentation where you talk about how the demands themselves are no longer radical, right?
Yeah.
So, of course, there's also the suggestion that maybe it was never radical in the first place, but the point would be that today there seems to be, on face, a different character to the demand for black representation than it might have had in, say, the 1950s. Like
Yeah.
a formal demand for representation in the state. Now, what the stakes of the latter were is maybe not relevant to this discussion, but the point is just that like that people seem to just like take up that history and say that like the way that people were talking about it then is appropriate to what can and ought to take place now. It seems as though that takes on a different character, not just because like time has passed, but because like how politics is happening has changed. That seems to be Trump. I don't know. And it's not just that he's like beaten them, like you're done. That's
Yes.
And now it's just like Pyrrhic. Now it's just that identity politics is like right, but then it's not the way to Trump or something like that. But it seems as though actually politics has capitalism doesn't demand that in the same way, like it doesn't have to deal with it in the same way that it might have had to 40 years ago. I don't know. I'm kind of just like speaking off the cuff. And speculatively here.
Yeah, it's that identity is way more soluble than the identity politicians would want to think, I suppose. Like that, like Trump's with like the ease with which Trump can just like appeal to quote unquote marginalized identities as Americans, as actually just like members of like the forgotten men and women of the working class. Like that seems to be like it just seems to like so easily bypass the categories that the Democrats would want to campaign on, which is like we will help black people and we will help like women and gays and stuff like that, and so like it's true, like Trump just seems to sidestep all that with a lot of ease. Of course he has to deal with it insofar as it's just like a kind of like ossified part of like the Democratic strategy.
Where are my gays for show?
Exactly. Because that is like the sort of like default thinking of like the general like person, I suppose.
No, but I mean formally Trump support, like formally what Trump is talking about, of course, then he's not gonna say that he's anti-gay
Yes.
and anti-black or anti.
Are you insinuating that like he is, but those just like
No,
his
not
language
that
is
he
policy?
is, but like his appeal or even intended appeal is directed towards the
That sentiment.
Yeah, that sentiment. And what I'm trying to get is that what I always like to see Trump is as this like culmination of the structural problems within the Democrats. Like whatever they fail to do, the Trump like did it for them. Not did it for them, but like they grasp the structural failures by the Democrats and utilize them for his own agenda, in a sense.
Another way you can deal with Trump is just say that the new Republican Party that had to basically dissolve the Reagan coalition is now comprised of dissident Democrats. Trump, J.D. Vance, oh my god, I can't say her name, Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr.,
Was Musk a Democrat?
Musk was a
Yeah.
like all of these people are former Democrats who grew discontented with its direction and basically did a hostile takeover of the Republican Party from the inside. So the 2024 election basically became a referendum on the Democratic Party. Are people happy with the way that it had been running the country? And the primary people, like as the contestants in this, were former Democrats. The former Reagan constituency that was developed, like, have been totally ostracized from the party to the point that in 2024, there was like basically a dissident Republican convention held in Milwaukee simultaneously to the main RNC, comprised of like all of the former the former mainstream Republicans who had since become like sectarian losers.
I also think about in 2016, and it never, I couldn't really make sense of it at the time, probably because in part I was in 8th grade, but
Yeah, I was in
there-
6th grade.
there was like the Hillary comment that like really damaged her, if not her support, at least her image around talking about Trump's supporters as a basket of,
Deplorables.
a basket of deplorables. Because you mentioned that, I didn't quite make sense of your comment, but it seemed as though you were saying that what might be like the material appeal of Trump is like to the people who are, if not racist and sexist, then supportive of.
Okay,
you know,
I frame it this way. What Trump is that okay, Trump is telling. I mean, his political agenda, what he says, is like is like half truth, right?
Sure.
And on the surface level, he's saying that okay, he's representing America, but he's like underlying message is like this racist stuff. I'm not saying one is true over the other, but I'm saying they're both true about Trump.
Here,
And
can I-
Trump
let me-
is a combination of those two things.
I think one way to think about it is that which is actually a more substantive interpretation of Trump's political agenda depends on whether or not it actually amounts to a new political regime. In other words, that the whole basket of deplorables thing was controversial, exactly because those were the political stakes, which is like, are these discontents merely like the racists and the sexists,
Yeah,
or
yeah,
is there something else to it?
You could also just say it's Hillary being mad at all the people that voted for Obama in the primary and not her, because those are ultimately the people that also voted for Trump. It's the people that wanted change.
Yeah.
Because she was the conservative Democratic candidate in 2008, and Obama represented change. And the majority of Americans who actually voted like Obama,
Trump.
Biden,
Trump. Yeah.
Like that's the most normal voter you
Yeah.
can be in America, and yet people act like that doesn't exist.
Yeah, I mean, I want to say something about this because this doesn't also go back to the fascism question, which is like when Trump talks about like making like an American identity or like making an American population, I guess. The left takes that up as like him. They kind of like take that up as like him sidestepping the issue of race and sex and etc. And they think about that as being like him advocating for like the American identity as being the Volk. And so it's like that's like the accusation almost is like where Trump like is like able to kind of just totally cut through the like identity politics issue. They take it up as like him like ignoring reality or something in favor of like this like sort of Volk. But it actually
In fact, that they are themselves who are.
Well, wouldn't the,
They are those who ignore the reality.
yeah,
But
exactly.
Wouldn't the accusation that Trump is fascist be exactly that, which is that Trump is synthesizing like a Volk, which is in fact a national myth intended in order to like disparage minorities or like the marginal in society?
Yes, but the question is not like precisely that. It's more like I think the question for the left is like, well, like do these minority positions like quote unquote exist after all? Or
just more straightforwardly, like are these a radical
Yeah,
radical standpoint in opposition?
yes. I mean, for the Democrat, I don't think they care about it being radical, but for the left, yeah, exactly. It's like do these constituencies per se like have like a a radical like element or like a subjective like radical subjective element to them.
I mean, I'm thinking about how J.D. Vance did his little Europe tour like a month or two ago, and he spoke to. Was he in like the EU Parliament?
I think so, yeah.
And he was like, "You all have a free speech problem because they." I don't think Le Pen had been like arrested at that point or like convicted or whatever in France, but the AfD had already had I think they'd been declared a terrorist organization
Yes.
or like a far right organization, which has legal repercussions in Germany. And you know, Vance is telling Europe like you have a free speech problem. And I remember like the German like Ministry of Foreign Relations or whatever like replied on Twitter. It's like, no, we have like a reactionary problem. And in a lot of ways, that seems to be kind of like a crystallization of the two like positions for what politics can be going forward. Not that free speech entails a reactionary politics, because that begs the question of like what actually is the political substance of a party like the AfD.
I mean, the other end of it is that France and Germany might be the last neoliberal countries standing before they actually have to exit it. They might be the last defenders of neoliberalism in a funny way.
Yeah. But then it seems as though like the Trumpian realignment, so to speak, in terms of rethinking what the like fault lines of political coalitions are. I mean, to put it in a bit of a coy way, it's an imperial project. Like, it seems as though it's not just a matter of like realigning America, but like making sure that the shadow is cast over the whole world. I'm not sure what the stakes of those are, but of course that is a dynamic that takes place in neoliberalism too.
Well, the
Although
other
there hasn't been as
one,
much.
like the whole basis for this was already in neoliberalism. It's not about like Trump's doing. It's about the fact that actually neoliberalism relied on a kind of like international free trade agreement. It was actually like it needed like extreme international economic controls to actually accomplish that in the first place. And so if you actually want to move away from neoliberalism, you have to make the entire world do it.
Yeah.
Like it's already, you actually need to do that to move away from neoliberalism at all.
Well, but the contingent circumstance is that it seems as though it's coming from the like divine mandate of Trump in the United States, rather than some sort of like spontaneous coalition of like-minded people, in the way that one might have said is the case for, i.e., Reagan and Thatcher as like parallel but like simultaneous phenomena.
I mean, it seems like that only because we're just hearing it from like the dominant liberal parties in Germany and France. But like there was like the millennial left in Europe that actually made contestant parties that were anti-neoliberal, like Syriza and Podemos, but they ran unsuccessful governments, and then basically the neoliberal coalition, the EU, actually came back in control, and that's who we get to hear all the time now.
I suppose, I mean, if I were to ascribe stakes to the difference, I feel like it's just whether or not, I don't know with confidence. I'm pretty sure it's just that like the political transformations involved in the transition from Fordism to neoliberalism were protracted but relatively homogenous. In other words, that it seemed as though like Reaganism was international, like per se, and it didn't really require the.
Oh no, at the beginning everyone thought like what Reagan was doing was like a total failure. And it was basically, the only other previous political models for it were just like random experiments done in like New Zealand and Chile. During the first like 3 years of Reagan's term, it seemed like a failure.
Well, during Trump's it will too, but when was Thatcher elected prime minister?
I don't remember.
I guess the point is it seems as though Trump is like going at it alone in a way that there are like parties which, if they were to come to power in their respective countries, would change the character of it, but that the fact that they're not makes the like international landscape seems to be subject to far more inertia than.
There's an article in the FT
Yeah.
or something recently about the new Canadian Prime Minister, and it's funny because it was actually a pretty solid article, but it was basically about like actually the new Canadian Prime Minister has to be the post-neoliberalism candidate, and even though he's like pitching himself as like, I am the anti-Trump candidate, he actually has to like be.
He has to play the game.
He has to he has to play the game and assert Canada as like a country that isn't just an appendage of the United States, which actually requires implementing like post-neoliberalism in Canada in a way that like the Trudeau coalition never actually did or had to. And they're like the last of like the previous NAFTA countries to do that because Mexico had already done it. Because they actually wanted to make a one-on-one deal with Trump because Mexico also got screwed by NAFTA. Canada is the biggest beneficiary of it.
And Scheinbaum has obviously made clear that she's willing to play the game with
Yes.
Trump.
And so did AMLO. And so did the guy before AMLO, whose name I can't say right now.
Obergefell? Am I thinking of the right person?
I can't remember.
Never mind. Should we wrap this up? Do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say something about this, like Trump being like the sort of like single indexer of post-neoliberalism at this time, which is like, it does seem like I was gonna include in the presentation something about the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund, stuff like that, and NATO and these sort of like free trade and like international organizations, which, I mean, Trump was like it's like there's any memory I have of Trump's first term, it was like his opposition to NATO. Like his tensions with like Hungary and stuff like that. Because that was like, to me, that was like core to my understanding of this. But I think I wanted to keep it like domestic because I think I just like it wanted to narrow the scope of it a bit. But yeah, like neoliberalism, like par excellence, is like the International Monetary Fund or like the World Bank, I think.
Sorry, that's an interesting thing to say because people think neoliberalism as like deregulation and like the withdrawal of state intervention, but you're identifying what seems to be like the international.
But of course, like the World Bank isn't a state.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
it's certainly a structure of like control in some way.
It's an intergovernmental organization which can put you into binding contracts.
That's true.
And states are basically in debt to like the World Bank by virtue of like threat of sanctions from other countries. So
Yeah.
it's like a state power.
I thought of like, I was also thinking about the Federal Reserve having more influence under neoliberalism, if that's true. But it's like, I mean, maybe this is kind of vulgar, but like I saw like the World Trade Organization and the World Bank and the IMF like as like just like these like super funds of finance capital, which are like managed by, of course, the states, but the states as like investors almost, or like a finance like capital, like actors, capitalists, and I think that's something that is yet to be seen under Trump 2.0.
I mean, if one were to characterize neoliberalism a little more substantively than kind of just the layman's like deregulation description, it would be that what neoliberalism was not deregulation so much as the concentration of the function of the national state to like monetary policy,
Yes.
and the displacement of like regulation to like international agreements.
Yeah.
It was actually the proliferation of state power, it wasn't like its withdrawal. Because
Yeah.
actually different parts of society became the state. And people took that to mean that power was just dispersed among corporations, but it actually meant that companies actually became like more arms of the state than they were in Fordism.
Yeah, because corporations are obviously subjected to legal
Repercussion.
regulation,
Yeah.
which has a political motivation.
In a way that didn't exist in Fordism.
But what does it seem that Trump is doing in contrast? It seems as though he's like strengthening the national state contra the like unaccountable like deep state.
Yeah,
and
the deep state.
unaccountable international organizations which of course seems to be the like the funhouse mirror for the like anti-globalization movement.
Yes.
Which of course Trump ran for president in 2000 with respect to.
Yes. I think anti-globalization, that's going to come back.
What do you mean by that?
Isn't that what Trump's already sort of?
Or yeah, I meant maybe what I mean is globalization is going to come back. Like people are going to be like, we need global trade
Like
again.
that's a conversation that's going to be happening.
Yeah. Maybe I'll leave it at that. All right.